I give you the permission slip attack, leveraging a confused deputy in Android with pSlip, and our speaker is Edward Warren.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone for making it out here tonight and all the great Shmoocon volunteers and staff who made this a great experience over the last 20 years. And I also realize this is the first talk after lunch, so hopefully this talk doesn't give you heartburn or indigestion. So we're going to go over a quick agenda. We have the staple, who am I? A brief refresher on confused deputies, a snapshot of the Android permission model, the pSlip toolkit, along with some conclusions. So the quick who am I? I'm a security analyst. All right, so just very briefly, I'm going to go over the who am I. I'm a security analyst at Sadara, and I've given some previous talks. Last year, I actually gave a talk about Android inter-app collusion. That's actually going to act as a segue. I've given a few B-sides talks. I also have many hobbies way outside the scope of this presentation, but I like bugs. And I want to let everyone know that the content of this presentation is solely my own and is neither sanctioned, authorized, nor reflective of my employer's position. So here's a brief refresher on confused deputies. This won't be a slide reading, but I'm just going to go over it quickly. A confused deputy is a security flaw where a trusted application acting as the deputy is tricked into performing actions on behalf of an untrusted entity. And this often leads to unauthorized access or actions. And in Android, this occurs when an app with elevated permissions exposes components. This can be activities, providers, broadcast receivers, and can be exploited by a third-party application. And an example of a confused deputy, for those who are familiar with web hacking, you can just think of like a CSRF or cross-site request forgery. In that instance, the browser is acting as a deputy, inadvertently granting permissions to an attacker. Here's a quick snapshot of the Android permission model. It can be broken down to 3 types. Just to give everybody some context, I'm not sure where everyone's at when it comes to Android reverse engineering, but there's 3 main types: normal and runtime permissions along with signature. And for normal permissions, they are granted at install time. Runtime permissions, essentially a user has to explicitly opt in to give the app permission. And when it comes to signature, part of the reason for signature permissions is just to make sure that it helps to secure communication within the ecosystem of the app, within the same developer, enforcing certificate. We're going to move forward here. Now, some quick examples of normal permissions. These would be things like the ability to vibrate your phone, to set an alarm, or even the ability to access the internet or to open network sockets. And some examples of runtime permissions. These control dangerous actions, things like the ability to access the GPS or your camera, or even the ability to place a phone call. I want you to remember the ability to place a phone call because that's going to be the crux of this attack here. So, hello? All right. Hopefully this is better. So before I get into the permission slip attack, I just want to give a little bit more additional context. In Android, when it comes to inter-process communication, this is facilitated by binder by using intents. And this is going to be very important, as we'll see here in a few moments here. So when it comes to intents, intents help facilitate different calls that can be propagated by the intent. And there's a big long list here. We're just going to focus on 2 just to give some additional context here. For example, you see action pick or action call. If you're an example where action pick would be used, let's say you have a video editing application. Your application will prompt you to select the corresponding application, and that would usually be done with action pick. This is kind of an agnostic. It doesn't have a one-to-one correlation to a dangerous permission. However, certain actions like action call has a one-to-one correlation with the call phone permission. Action call allows the default Android dialer to place a phone call without user interaction. And this can be in contrast to the action dial. When it comes to action dial, all that will do is pre-populate the dial. So one requires a user to explicitly opt in by clicking. The other one will just automatically start the phone call. So when I was looking over applications that I felt were leaking their call phone permission, I got a lot of feedback from developers. And I found this in many applications at this point. Often the most common feedback, besides just not getting any reply at all, was the fact that they would state something along the lines of this. the documentation says the caller app should have the call phone permission. Either the documentation is wrong or this is a bug with the Android system. So at first I thought, well, maybe I did find a bug with the Android system. So I had to do some additional investigation just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. All right, so let's look at what call phone actually does to initiate a phone call. It specifically states here, to place a phone call directly, use the action call action and specify the phone number. It also states that the user doesn't need to tap the call button. And as you see at the bottom, it says the action call action requires that you add the call phone permission to your manifest. The scenario we're going to be going over is the idea that another installed application, a malicious application, can place a phone call without declaring that manifest. And this is because of the idea of a confused deputy, where a vulnerable application exports its component. So just quickly going over call phone versus action dial. Remember I said earlier that action dial was actually the safe action that pre-populates. It's just more of the same. Just would like to use these as notes here. So this is really the case of the devil being in the details. So let's look at the bottom again. Note, if your app targets M is Android Marshmallow, or otherwise known as Android 6, and above, and declares as using the call phone permission, which is not granted, then attempting to use this action will result in a security exception. So this is, I got some additional feedback after reporting this issue, and essentially what this boils down to is, it's essentially a case of, I like to look at it as, the feedback that I got was basically that retroactively, this was an undocumented case where because remember, when you're using a Google phone, typically you're using a Google dialer. And most of the call phone dialers do not leak this call phone permission. But in the cases of poorly coded call phone dialers that allow you to send this intent on an exported component, you'll be able to place a phone call without user interaction. And a lot of this boils down to is a misinterpretation of what the developer notes state. I'm just going to go over that quickly again here. The action call requires that you use the call phone permission, but I can show you plenty of examples where this is not the case. So what is the permission slip attack? In short, I made it up. The long explanation is that it describes a particular instance of intent injection in Android that leverages a pattern of insecure coding practices that allow an unprivileged app to exploit a privileged or deputy application's exported components to place a phone call. And the way I like to visualize it is, if you think about like a ship manifest, where it will list all the contents of the ship, or think about a permission slip like in high school where it explicitly grants your child the ability to perform certain actions like going to the park. The slip in this case was a slip on the developer by using the wrong intent action. And this GIF is courtesy of Sora. But since it boils down to a Trojan horse or a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I don't expect you guys really to read this. This is really just a case study. This is some recent loot, I'm going to call it, with the pSlip attack. These CVEs are actually published this last week. I have a lot attributed just by using this tool, but these were literally published in the last week, just to give context that you can still find many vulnerable applications. In fact, last night I actually submitted a report for HackerOne for an application that was also vulnerable, so this is still very prevalent. And here's just a quick snapshot of an actual snippet of the Android manifest file, where you can see where in one instance they are actually using action dial, which is the safe form, but that's not the unfortunately for them, that component is not the issue. If you look on the bottom, this component is the issue. So in this scenario, it shows how the Android exporter is set to true, and that the Android intent filter allows action.call, which essentially results in the ability to send some data to the exported component and get a call to be initiated. Here's just a quick snapshot of the help menu. It's pretty standard. You have things like help, the ability to list all permissions, the ability to scan for custom permissions. Some additional features of this toolkit is not just restricted to the ability to use call intents. It also looks for instances where an intent filter will allow you to explicitly invoke the JavaScript scheme. And I say explicit, I mean just the ability to use JavaScript. There are some cases where you'll see things like HTTP or HTTPS, and you don't see JavaScript. And a lot of those instances, you can still send it a JavaScript payload and it'll still execute. I'm going to give an example of that moving forward here. We already mentioned the call phone permission. This is just what the tool is looking for. And oftentimes if you're doing Android reverse engineering, like using JADX, just looking for the string secret is enough to find a secret. And a lot of this boils down to the fact that they're using a very common Java library where it's using versions of like secret key spec or IV parameter spec, just a very basic crypto library. And of course, some other options, export as HTML, and yeah, you can scan for all or skip the AES. When it comes to the AES scanning is accomplished by using JADX CLI. It's a little bit slower than APK tools. So I mean, because for example, APK tool can scan for everything in about 5 seconds. Just adding just parsing with JADX can make your scan take upwards of 30 seconds to a minute. So I'm averaging about 5 seconds to scan for everything else but AES keys as of right now. And here's the format. I'm going to blow this up a little bit here, but I tried to organize it intuitively. You see package, component, issue type, along with details. You'll get a progress bar and so forth. If you look right here, you'll see where the iterations are about 5 seconds versus the second scan that can take upwards about 15 seconds here. Here's it blown up. I'll also, along the top, it says the manifest analysis is started with 4 processes. If you'd like to modify that, you can just set whatever you'd like. Just obviously don't go over the amount of cores that you have available. And at the bottom is an example for TCL browser. This application is actually intended for Android TVs. But it's an example how the intent filter did not explicitly state that the JavaScript scheme would be accepted. Now, why do you care about being able to inject JavaScript? You'll see that in a few moments. We're almost actually done here, though. Here's just an output of how it looks in HTML. Hopefully it's a little easier to read. Pretty much the same basic idea with the, separated by package, component, issue type, and so forth. And at the very bottom, you'll see an application that did not appear on the previous CLI console output. I'd like to just give them a shout out to Alex and his co-presenter for Open Sesame Unlocking Bluetooth Padlocks. This is a great B-Sides London talk where it shows about what you can actually do with hard-coded keys. Usually applications that are hard-coding AES or DES or AES keys, they're directly linked to IoT. So think about smart camera, lock. This tool can find hard-coded keys. It's just an ancillary feature I decided to add for my own personal usage. We're going to keep it moving here. And this is just going to segue into the very short demo because I'm almost out of time here. This research was called Exposing and Addressing Security Vulnerabilities in Browser Text Input Fields. And why you should care about this is that what this brings to light is the fact that oftentimes when you need to exploit something, you have to chain or basically use some form of polyglot exploitation. In this case, what they talked about is how different websites store your saved credentials with behind the asterisk fields. So they break this down to 2 different types, type A and type B. An example of type A is the ability for a malicious browser extension to grab credentials that are stored if it has access to the DOM tree. And type B are instances or websites that are literally storing your password within the HTML in the outer HTML field. All right, so here's an example of a payload that I'm going to show you where this application, even though it doesn't show JavaScript in its intent filter, will still allow you to send JavaScript. Here's a quick example of the demo. I'm actually repurposing this demo from the previous Fire Talk. I just didn't actually get a chance to finish it. What this demo shows is me entering my password. If the password was already saved or cached, it would have the same effect. I honestly just didn't feel like re-recording this. But what this is going to show is once I inject the payload, you're going to see an alert box which shows the password that's stored behind the asterisk. And instead of just showing an alert box, you could actually just exfiltrate it. But I didn't want to give anybody any ideas here, except for I'm saying it now. All right, so conclusions. Don't export components unnecessarily. Use inline permission and intent filters when appropriate. Hard coding AES or DS keys is probably a bad idea. And be wary of using custom permissions because, for example, if you make a custom permission but you set it to a normal value, then you can inadvertently allow applications to use it without users explicitly opting in. I didn't really go over that last portion, but the tool actually detects for variants of that. And yeah, if you want to check out the tool, feel free to connect with me, and I appreciate your time. And I'm not even sure where I'm at here on time here. Oh, wow. Let's better do that a little quickly. Now, is there any questions?
Yeah, how does the requirement for the ignorant intent-based exploits of having a malicious app affect the CSS score?
So it really, okay. So you're asking how. You're asking how the CVSS score affects the rating because it requires a pre-installed application. That is that's definitely a good question. So I've gotten one or two responses, and it really depends on who you talk to because one of my favorite researchers, Maddie Stone, she has the viewpoint that if you're using it's not considered a physical attack because how easy it is to trick a user into pre-installing an application. So I've gotten both network and local. As to which one is correct, I'm not making the argument because one resulted in a higher payout. That's a great question. Any other questions? Yes. So, okay, thank you. So most of the applications did not appear in scope. I did find a couple on HackerOne. They're actually still in the process of finishing that. It's a shame that the Google Play Security Reward Program, that they ended that because one of the applications I found that had a couple 100 million installs was under that, and I was able to get a payout, but they unfortunately discontinued that program. Hopefully they'll reopen it up in the future. That's a great question, sir. Any other questions?
Over here.
Yes.
So the permissions you mentioned in the talk were already permissions given to the application. Is there any way to maybe add those permissions to an existing application to be able to make, for example, the calls? Or does that require some other?
Well, I mean, you have if you're making an application, you do. Okay. All right. So I believe what your question was: does the attack allow you to actually grant the malicious application the permission? So part of the logic here when it comes to confused epi is that you're kind of a vulnerable call dialer or an application that's granting this permission is inadvertently granting it in the form of the confused deputy, but it technically doesn't have it because if it actually had the permission and it wasn't granted, then there'd be the security exception. So this is leveraging the other component, but that's a good question. And I believe that's probably the final question. So I want to thank everyone again for their time and hope you enjoy the rest of Shmoocon.